Okay, now moving on to Chris. Chris Bambery is a political activist and commentator and leading member of the International Socialist Group in Scotland. His latest book, A People's History of Scotland, has just been published by Verso and definitely well worth a purchase and a read. Over to you, Chris.
My Calvinist origins weigh heavily enough for me that I'm not a betting man, but if I was to encourage anyone to take a bet, I would bet on a yes vote in September. And I'd bet for the two reasons that Pete's kind of outlined. Firstly, the opinion polls don't indicate just how many of the lower sections of the population, working class, on the schemes, is going to come out and vote. And if they come out and vote, they're going to vote yes. And Pete's right about this. And they don't know. And secondly, the opinion polls don't know how 16 to 18-year-olds who've got to vote in this are going to vote either. And I think the indication are that they're going to vote for yes as well. But even if it's not, it's going to be a narrow result, and the issue is not going to be settled. And it's not going to be settled for a simple issue of demographics. The no vote is old, the yes vote is young. And the issue is not going to go away, because this is actually, I'm going to come on to it in a second, this issue is tied in as why you should be concerned about it with the whole issue of Britain and British decline, and that's not going to go away. And there is a divergence, and a growing divergence, between politics north of the border and south of the border. And that is most illustrated by the rise of UKIP in England, I'm afraid. Which doesn't, it will register something in Scotland, but it is clear there's a different agenda. Now, I'm not going to try and say there's a massive difference in social attitudes between working class areas of inner London, Doncaster, Liverpool, and Scotland. I don't think so. But there is a difference, for instance, over the argument over immigration. It is toxic in England. It is not toxic in Scotland. It is not really an issue. One part reason actually is the established parties don't want to make it an issue because we need migrants. The Scottish government wants migrants, right? But it's a massive difference, and the divergence will continue. I personally would vote in any circumstances for leaving the European Union because I believe it's a neoliberal club. But I think we should be aware that any referendum in Europe is likely to see, if Scotland remains in the Union, we'll see divergent results north and south of the border. And is going to lead to another shift in the political debate. So whatever happens, this is not going to be a sort of generational question settled. It's going to continue to rumble on. And at the very best, Scotland will remain like Quebec does in Canada, with a different nationalist government running Quebec, but never quite leaving. That is almost the best option there is in terms of maintaining a union now, and it's not one I would particularly entice. So I want to come on to it, and a second point I want to make is, I think what Pete's trying to suggest is absolutely right. It is not often that you get a chance to decide on whether or not you want to create a new state. That is what is happening. And that's not quite how Alex Salmond wants to pitch it, but it is actually what is being discussed in this mushrooming of meetings. And people are talking about a revival of the public meeting in Scotland, which is taking place across Scotland at the moment, where people are discussing what sort of society they would want. And if you think about it, it's just obvious, isn't it? If you're talking about setting up a new independent state, you're going to debate everything. And that is what's happening, and it's kind of exciting at the moment that people are doing this, and people are finding things out. You know, I'll just give you an illustration. Lots of young people I'm struck by know an argument about North Sea oil. That really, when Tony Benn proposed in the 1970s, he should set up a state-run central fund into which the oil money should be put for the benefit of the population, in this case the United Kingdom, and that was rejected by a Labour cabinet, which incidentally lied to the Scottish people, with Treasury officials lying as well to the extent of the wealth that was there in the North Sea. And I'm not going to listen to any Treasury official telling me what the ills of independence are, because they're liars, right? People know in Scotland that Norway did not do that, and Alaska did not do that. Now, Alaska is not a model of socialism, as you know. Alaska has a state central fund, which the oil money is invested in, which pays out to its citizens every year. In Norway, they use the money to provide social services, which are the envy of the population in this country. People in Scotland know that North Sea oil was wasted, completely frittered away, needlessly. We know that there is going to be a wind farm created in the Moray Firth, which could provide electricity for 80% of Scottish homes. Who owns the sea floor around the United Kingdom? The Crown Estates. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, they are selling it off at knockdown prices, just like they did at North Sea Oil, to get money quickly to inject into the Treasury, to multinational capitals around the world, with no notion if we're discussing what is a huge natural asset for Scotland, what actually could be done, and how that asset could be used. And people know this, and they're turning around and saying, surely it'd be better that having created a Scottish Parliament that we could control the seafloor around us, rather than the Crown Estates and Her Majesty the Queen. It is very shocking, actually, to think about this, that it's in the personal hold of this. And that's the sorts of issues that should be debated about. There is serious debate about how a new independent Scotland could actually begin to look at trading with different countries around the world. There is a discussion, and it's even in the SNP's white paper, about the possibility of industrial regeneration. Now, I know George Osborne has made references to industrial regeneration occasionally in terms of a United Kingdom context. There is no serious debate in the United Kingdom about industrial regeneration. And what it would mean, where would you focus on? Renewable energy is actually an obvious focus for anyone to seriously do that. And to start thinking about where you'd develop an economy in a different way. And I think when you start talking about it in that way, I think it's quite important to say, why should people here in England support Scottish independence? There's a couple of issues I just want to touch on. A rather charming comrade from the English left explained to me at some length that they could not support Scottish independence because Scotland is not an oppressed nation. This does not come as a surprise to me. You can wander the streets of Glasgow and look at the street signs in the centre and see they're named after slave owners. A quick visit to Edinburgh, you'll see enough generals who are the boot boys of empire, statues adorning the sea. It's not about the fact we're an oppressed nation. One of the things is actually, I think if we made a break with the United Kingdom, we seriously have to discuss how we would rectify what Scotland did in terms of its vanguard role in Europe, not least in empire, not least in Ireland. It's a point actually that Hamish Henderson makes in Freedom Come All You, which is the song of the Scottish Republican left, when he says, no more do we want to see ships sail from the Broom at Law, with wains in Pitheads and Quackens mourning, their fathers gone off to war, but neither do we want people around the world in countries we have harried, fearful of the tune Scotland the Brave. That's in that song. In other words, he's saying if we make the break, it's only then can we seriously rectify. Don't make the break, we're stuck in a country which is going to keep going to war at the behest of the Americans anywhere in the world, and where our foreign secretary is in Ukraine now telling porcupines about what is going on and stacking up the war situation. I've been told that we should be careful of nationalism. Well, I have to come back to it. In Britain today, where is the threat of nationalism? Is it Scottish nationalism? Or is it perhaps the British state going on about migrants and Muslims and trailing behind Nigel Farage in trying to prove who's tough in immigration? Where is the ideology of nationalism, which is the danger here? If you were a young Muslim in London, would you be worried about Scottish nationalism? You wouldn't. And you probably know that the latest opinion polls for Scottish Muslims are 64% in favour of a yes vote. Right? You'd be more worried about the police knocking down your door and carting you off for some supposed crime. And of course, the last refuge of any Labour MSP is somewhere someone has written out a script which goes like this. We mustn't vote for independence because that would be a betrayal of our brothers and sisters in Doncaster, in Liverpool, in Manchester. It would be breaking the solidarity of the working class. These same MSPs must want to look up the dictionary to discover what the word solidarity means. They can't have said it in 25 years. Their concept of solidarity is an interesting one because it's quite interesting. Whenever they make this reference, it always stops at the English Channel or the Irish Sea. It never goes beyond that to the people of Greece or the people of Ireland or the people of Cyprus or elsewhere fighting austerity. So it's based on the notion of the British state, not a European-wide anti-austerity movement, not even internationalism, it's ensconced within that. But I also have to say, it's not really a cutting argument in Craigie, in Lockheed, in Drumchapel. You'd have to be over 50, and this is a depressing fact I have to bring to the table. You would have to be over 50 in any meaningful way to say the solidarity of the British working class is what we should preserve. Because I can remember the miners' strikes in the 1970s, I remember the poll tax movement, I can remember the miners' strike in 84, 85. Anyone under the age of 40, it's meaningless. You are being asked to stay in the United Kingdom, right, in the hope that things might get better. Right, and I'm suggesting if there was going to be a mass strike wave tomorrow, it would alter many of the things I'm saying tonight, in the hope that's going to change. In my book, People's History of Scotland, I say, well, why not do the Shawshank Redemption option? You get out, and then encourage the others to escape as well. Why would you say, if your prison wing had the ability to get out, why would you stay waiting for the rest of the prison to get out as well? You'd make the break and hope you'd smuggle the key back in the birthday cake, wouldn't you? It's a nonsensical argument in terms of terms. And I'm sorry to have to say it like this. It's not UCS in 1971 when we're all pulling together. And it brings me on to why I think you should support it. Why people support independence in Scotland is one, democracy. We do not want Tory rule. We didn't vote for it. Now, I know sections of people, it's true elsewhere in England, but actually we have an escape pod now. And we're going to take the escape pod. And it's not just the Tory rule. We didn't like the Labour rule either from 1997 to 2010. In fact, in some ways that was worse because we had expectations in it. Right? And they created a Scottish Parliament in the belief it would settle the matter forever, but it hasn't. And of course, once you've got a Scottish Parliament, it then raises what democracy you want. And of course, you look at Westminster, the expenses scandal, men in sitting on wool sacks, people wearing tights, all the green leather benches, and you think maybe you could do something a bit better in terms of democracy than democracy in this. This is the first issue in terms of it. It's a democratic issue, and I make the point that, you know, I sympathise with people in Newcastle and elsewhere in London who didn't vote Tory either, but we have an option here. Secondly, it's about Britain, and this is why I think people here have to take it on board. What does Britain represent? And I'm prepared to take the responsibility of Scotland actually in building empire and forging empire. I'm not going to ignore it. We were part of the construction of a British state from 1707 onwards. It was built on war, colonialism, slavery. Do you want me to keep going through the agenda? Pete talked about it. We are tied into a country which is in an endless war at the behest of the Americans. Right, that's not an anti-American statement, but I mean, it's not going to stop. Right? We want to get off. Like you, we oppose the Iraq war and everything else, but actually here's an option we can get off, and I think it's infeasible that a Scottish Parliament would ever vote now to send Scottish troops. It will open up any discussion now about whether or not Scottish troops should be sent. Whether or not it stays in the Union, they'll be sent to fight in another of these imperialist wars. By voting to quit, Trident goes. Financial Times says it's not going to go anywhere in the United Kingdom elsewhere. It can only go to Le Havre in France or Virginia. And I'd have to say that if you think about September the 19th, the one thing I'd love to see is David Cameron having to explain that having lost an empire, he has now lost the United Kingdom. And conversely, the idea that he'd be the smile on his face if they won would be enough. But lastly, just in Britain as well. As I said, democracy is not going to get better again. And thirdly, what's on offer here? Well, let's just look at what's happened. There's a report published by two Sheffield academics just last week saying what has happened since the financial crash of 2008. It says that there has been the biggest drop in wages, and when people come along and say, if you vote for independence, you're going to take a hit in your living standards and pensions, which is the big threat. Well, actually, we have just taken it. Wages fell between 2010 and 2013 in this country by 8.5%. Margaret Thatcher never did that. We have none of us, unless you were around in the 1920s, lived through a collapse in living standards of this scale. They say it's not going to get better before 2020. And they point to the reasons why. The ongoing stagnation of work, which is about the lack of investment in this country, I'll come on to in a minute. A combination of the concentration of jobs which are being created in low-paid work, the rise in precarious work, and thirdly, the wage cuts and wage freezes which are continuing even as the economy gets better. And if you look at the United Kingdom, it's based on a low investment model with the lowest investment of any of the leading capitalist economies around the world. And what these two academics point out is, and what else have we done by a policy of quantitative easing and all the rest of the gobbledygook? What have we created around this economic recovery? A housing boom centre in London, a resurgent financial centre once again, based in the City of London, and an economy that looks rather like the economy did pre-2008. There has been no attempt to rebuild industry. Investment in manufacturing has continued to decline, and Britain is continuing on its merry way. Sorry, I would like to get off in terms of that. And I'm going to end by that. Having gone through all that, I think any discussion of what a different Scotland could look like, you could actually begin to piece something together. And it could begin to encourage people down south. I know enough people in London know that you do not pay university fees in Scotland unless you are English. In fact, strangely, the English are the only people who do pay university fees. The Europeans don't. Right? But they know that. They know already that pensioners get a better deal in Scotland. They know that many of the social services are actually better in terms of that. They know that the political debate is being carried out by two parties. The two parties are Labour and the SNP. The Tories are dead. The discussion is rhetorical, at least at a social democratic level. It is not this blind neoliberalism, which is just every party at Westminster is chasing behind. Right? I'm not saying there's a guarantee we can move towards a socialist Scotland, but unfortunately we're starting well back in the field 3 decades into a neoliberal offensive. Actually, there are things we could achieve, things that we could win, and we have won some things already. Right? Getting rid of the bedroom tax. And if we won those things and we created something that looks a lot better than is offered at Westminster, might it not encourage people in England and Wales to start thinking there is actually an alternative? To quote a phrase of someone I remembered unhappily in the 1980s. Yes, there is an alternative, and even in the confines of capitalism, actually, there is an alternative you can fight for and achieve. I'll come on the question of racism. Racism does exist in Scotland, and one of the reasons I think actually you don't see quite the same debate, I made a very specific point, is none of the established parties have gone quite down the road of Westminster in targeting migration because Scotland needs migrants. But I think there's also something else which I do want to say. In my book I published a report on Islamophobia in Scotland. After the killing of Trooper Rigby in Greenwich, there was a spate of attacks on various mosques and things in England. And I'm going to say this, but how many were there in Scotland? And the answer is 0. Now, every opinion poll in the survey of Muslims in Scotland shows they feel happier in terms of Scottish identity. In large part because the SNP, and I'm not going to try and run up to Salmond, he supported the Afghan war, but opposed the Iraq war. And opposed some of the worst Islamophobia of it. And in that process have actually won over a lot of the younger Muslim population as a consequence. So a lot of the Muslim population have shifted as a consequence of that. Well, they do point out they feel uneasy that one of the key features of Scottish identity, a word I'm not very happy, a phrase I'm not happy about, is alcohol. So there is shift. So I'm not trying to argue against it. I do think the question of the British state is quite important. I mean, I'm not sure, you know, it's not true that people in Bangladesh should be dancing on the streets if Scotland broke with the UK. But I tell you what, if I was in West Belfast in the last week, I would feel that the Scots should be making the break, because anything to bring down the British state, which is just trying to railroad Gerry Adams in the most disgusting way, and I've got no particular time for Adams now, it's rather what he was they're going for than what he is now. But actually it makes it even more disgusting in a way, just how vengeful these people are, I think comes through it. On your point about, I agree with you on this, and I think it's an argument. I mean, you know, obviously we should bitterly oppose that Salmond overturned the SNP's historical opposition to NATO. I think it will be quite difficult from Trident, but we'll see. I mean, it's an issue which burns, you know, all the way back to when Polaris, the American missiles, were stationed in the 60s. It's been an issue in Scottish politics and a resentment that we've been foisted with these things. But I think you're right. I think there has to be a debate, and it did come up at the RIC conference. Actually, what would a Scotland look like? I personally would like to see a Scotland outside the European Union. This may sound bonkers, but actually there are countries, Iceland, which is doing it. I mean, you know, I don't want to say Switzerland, it's a horrible thought, isn't it? But no, they're not in the European Union. Right? You don't actually have to be in the European Union to be in Europe, believe it or not. Right? In terms of that, the IMF, GATT, the World, I mean, there's a whole set of institutions I think you'd have to question, and think, who would you want to trade with? Who would you want to make, you know, in the current crisis, who could you make, who better perhaps to make, you know, to come to some sort of arrangement with the Chinese? Is the British state going to do it? I think not really. You know, I think the Chinese have got long memories of what the British United Kingdom did in China. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But the last couple of things, why I think we should also come through on. I think Cameron. I think it's worth thinking about what Cameron would be smiling like a Cheshire cat if there's a no vote. He'll be absolutely sick if it's a yes vote. I mean, really, I think you have to say there is semi-hysteria in the British ruling class. I have to say, I don't think it's a big debate in the streets of London, and I'm pleased Counterfire's organised it, but you just have to read the Telegraph. It is hysterical about Scottish independence. Read City AM. I mean, it's just got regular, its reaction to the CBI pulling out the No campaign was literally hysterical. And they were saying, big business in London, wake up, you've got to oppose this. British power is going. I mean, they were utterly hysterical about what the constitution is going to be in terms of it. And they get upset. I mean, there are people in big business who support it, and I have to laugh. The head of one of these horrible hedge funds, Aberdeen Investment, which got said today, we do business in 30 countries, it's not going to make any difference, there's one more. I mean, there are some capitalists who see the sense of it, but they're really tied up with really the sense of what happens to Britain if Britain goes. I mean, I don't know if they'll keep the European UN security council, but Britain's going to look poxy. It really is. It has lost. Just keep going through those. Remember, if you look on YouTube, you can still see the Union Jack being lowered in country after country after country as the British Empire collapsed. To lose Scotland, and this is an integral part of their world. I mean, David Cameron goes stag hunting on the estates of his stepfather in Iowa. The Queen. Now imagine the Queen. I know that Salmon says that we're going to keep her, but I mean, she must be a wee bit worried. In terms of what's going on, and the estate she's got there. Just the investment. And I quote in my books, I'm a senior English civil servant who works in this. It was on holiday in the Highlands and says, it was asked, why do you want space? We've got to have space. It's sort of playground. It's going to go. And that's why I think it's a massive issue for the British ruling class. And I think people have cottoned onto it. And incidentally, Cameron thinks it's going to be a yes vote. Yeah. And is hysterical about it, but can't do anything about it because the one person who cannot go to Scotland to urge a no vote is David Cameron.
This evening.
Okay, well, the first thing I want to say, what I think people in England should not do, which is should not get tied up with a discussion which seems to break out in sections of the matter about English identity, which usually involves people sort of getting involved in Morris dancing or something. And I think one of the interesting things actually about Scotland is actually, I think it is quite interesting how the Scottish cultural scene has changed in my lifetime from essentially being a sort of Kale Yard, White Heather Club, shortbread, militarist culture, which is what it was, and has actually transformed itself into something which is quite different. And it's not about actually tartan and bagpipes and all that stuff. And I think it's an interesting change. I'm not going to say all of that's evaporated, but something has changed actually in the concept of it. And this comes in actually to the idea of Scottishness and identity, because I think it's true. The moment where, strangely, I think Scotland decided, it was working class Scotland decided it was going to seize on its badge of identity, the Scottish, as a symbol of working class resistance to it. It wasn't under Thatcher, it was in 1992. When, strangely, a Conservative government of John Major won an election they weren't expected to. And the Tories were not wiped out in Scotland as they wanted. And there was an eruption onto the streets, spontaneously more or less, of people demanding a Scottish Parliament, which is why Labour and the SNP were forced to eventually back this. But it was at that time when working class people, having been through the cosh, will find something to use as a symbol of resistance, a badge, and they've taken it. And of course there's a mythology about the fact that Scots are more social democratic, pro-welfare, West Ray, and all the rest of it. But there is an element, if you like, of common sense to it, that working class people have seized in this as a symbol of something that, of our resistance to this. And it's not unimportant, it's had a cultural impact on it. I mean, it's interesting, when the Scottish Parliament was opened, they actually chose Freedom Come All You as the song to launch it. This is a Republican anti-imperialist song talking about socialism. Right, so it kind of does represent something. And that's why I think we shouldn't get too hung up about this. The second thing I want to turn on to as well is in the question of what's wrong with Britain. And I think it's not just the question of the empire and imperialism. These are really important things, but to be honest, it doesn't really knock in the doors of govern. It's not, people aren't going to vote yes in govern to bring down British imperialism. But I think it is important to turn around and say the British state is failing its people. The United Kingdom is a failure. It's failing its people. Levels of child poverty. The way we treat our pensioners. Right, the lack of investment. It's a complete scandal. I mean, of the G8 countries, Britain is at the bottom in terms of investment, which is we're a low productivity, low skill economy. The dominance of the city in finance, which means a low wage economy, incidentally, means crap jobs in service sectors. That's what it means in terms of a huge disparity in wealth. All of this are reasons to break with it. And to break does open up. There will be issues. But actually, I am interested in a discussion about what industrial regeneration could look like. Really going for renewable resources and energy on a massive scale, which is possible in Scotland, given its natural resources. And it also confronts, and Brian raised an issue, it also confronts inside the working class movement in this island another issue, which is the complete identity between the Labour Party and the British state. And that is not just because Labour has always supported every war that's come along. It's not just because you think about the Labour Party in terms of. I remember a guy called Michael Foot. Right? Michael Foot wrote a book in which he lauded Enoch Powell as being his friend and someone who was to be admired because he was a great parliamentarian. Right? Now, Michael Foot was of the left in the Labour Party, but he thought Powell was great because he loved Westminster. It's like Dennis Skinner is the expert in Westminster Constitution. He loves the place, despite being a rebel. It's immersed in the British state, the Labour Party. And actually, Scotland going would be a break on it. It would be a break. The numpties don't realise this. When Douglas Alexander doesn't realise he can never be Prime Minister of Britain, it's gone. There is never going to be another Scottish Prime Minister of Britain. You're thinking that. It's not going to happen ever again. Unless there was a real Churchill sort of moment in 1940, gone, come through it. And that's why I think we come through. Sectarianism, I just wanted to say, sectarianism is a problem which has blighted Scotland. But where does it come from? Sectarianism against Catholics and against Irish people. The first Orange Lodge in Scotland was set up after 1798 by a militia sent to Northern Ireland to crush the United Irishmen uprising. In other words, a section of the British state bringing the ideology they used in Northern Ireland at the time back to Scotland. It was a consequence of the Great Famine and what then was enrolled in it and all the rest of it. It's tied into the British state. It's not in the psyche of Scottish people. It's a consequence of something. And the interesting thing about it is, what does the Orange Lodge, which is a shadow of itself in Scotland, where does it stand in the independence debate? It's no. And who's trying to curry its favour? It's the Labour Party, which is now defending Orange Lodge marches going through working class areas as a symbol of some cultural thing. I need to shut and all the rest of it. And lastly, where do we go after all this? See, the truth is, the left is in a state everywhere. Let's be honest about it. But even at the last Scottish election, which is the nadir of the left's fortunes, we would have got, if the left had come together, one MSP. Now, if we could get our act together, we could get elected to Holyrood. We remember when we got 6 MSPs, right? It's not infeasible. It's going to be difficult, but we've got to put that argument. And you're right, there has to be a pole of attraction. We're going to have arguments after independence. But I'll tell you what, I'm going to end it. You know, I have to say, I want to say this. Just think, if Scotland voted no, seriously think of David Cameron's face on that morning of the 19th of September. And then think of him having to go to Buckingham Palace to explain to Elizabeth Windsor, sorry, love, Balmoral is now in a separate country. You know, I mean, that must be the nadir of any Prime Minister's, British Prime Minister's, most they have to explain, sorry, love, we've lost Scotland.